Okay, so welcome
Thank you.
to Poetry Sunday, everyone. Uh, what's going on with my clothing here? So today we're doing Allen Ginsberg, part two. You'll remember last time we read, what did we read? The Sunflower Sutra, right? Oh man, oh man. I mentioned this book, which some of you might want to take a look at, A Blue Hand, The Beats in India. And actually, you can see in that photo, there's Ginsberg and a monkey. And it's quite an interesting story about, I mean, all those personalities. And I think I said this last time, we tend to sometimes, especially at some distance, we tend to kind of romanticize and idealize the spiritual seekers and the spiritual path and all that. But this is intimately, and it's written with enough intimacy and information and clear-eyedness, so that we're reminded, oh yeah, people are people. We keep getting that one over and over again. People are people, and people on the spiritual path are people.
Would you believe?
Right. They're people on the spiritual path. There's a saying that every saint has a past, and every sinner has a future. So, another book. This is my big fat edition of Allen Ginsberg's collected poems, and this is fun because this is where he signed it to me.
Oh.
Yeah. Back in 1990, I think. We also mentioned last time that the big poem, the big watershed event for Ginsberg, and pretty much for his circle, with the Beats, Ginsberg, Kerouac, Burroughs, couple of others. The big moment was this reading in 1955 or 56 at the Gallery 6 in San Francisco, which is where Ginsberg read his new poem, Howl, which has been called the Beat Declaration of Independence. There they were in the middle of the Cold War, in the middle of the, what they felt as the oppressiveness of the new post-war conformist Eisenhower era culture, and here they were exploring new avenues of consciousness, mostly at that point, mostly through drug experimentation, and also different avenues of sexual exploration, at a time when, if you were anything other than, straight hetero, get married and have a couple of kids and live in the suburbs, it was, there was something wrong with that. And so Ginsberg found himself in this, giving this howl of, well, I mentioned last time, this word beat really has these two aspects. And this is coming not from me, it's coming from them. You can see interviews with Kerouac, where he talks about this, and he wrote about this. It's beat. Well, there's many levels to it. It's the beat of music, the new jazz music that also was kind of opening up new ways of being and feeling, and beat as in the beatific vision, and beat as in being beat down. Right. So you got your crucifixion and your resurrection, right there together. So this was, the howl was a howl of pain. It was a howl of being beat down, and also a howl of ecstasy. So I thought Okay, let's do it. I'm going to read not the whole thing. It's in 3 parts. It's quite long, but I'm going to, I'm going to read it from the screen. I'm going to read Howl Part 1. If you have small children in the room, you may want to send them away. There's some not G-rated language in it. And what else do you need to know? References to a couple of the other beats, Kerouac and Hunky and Burroughs and these guys, but you'll get the general idea. So okay, is everyone seeing that?
Yes. Yes.
Small.
It's small,
Excellent.
but yes.
Howl. Okay. Oh, notice that the dedication is to Carl Solomon. Carl Solomon is was the fella that Ginsberg met when Ginsberg was packed away into an insane asylum for a while, or Rockland mental institution, and Carl Solomon was a buddy that he met there. So this is Howl for Carl Solomon, Part 1. Okay, one more thing I want to mention. Last time we mentioned this, the long lines, and Ginsberg talking about the human breath, the human body, and the breaths that come from it as being the true unit of poetic expression. And also, please notice the repetition of initial words. That which you may recall is very much a Whitman-esque device, coming back to, that's how you keep the beat. That's how you keep, there's no rhythm. Well, there's organic rhythm, oceanic rhythm, and sometimes what seems like sexual rhythm holding it together, but there's no regular meter, there's no rhyme. What holds it together is the coming back to that word who, and all these references to who, these all come out of the first line, the famous first line, I saw the best minds of my generation, meaning the beat generation, meaning the young people of the post-war generation who were looking for something different. Okay, so all the who then refers to basically all of their adventures in their kind of wild seeking for something else. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness, starving, hysterical, naked, dragging themselves through the Negro streets at dawn, looking for an angry fix. Angel-headed hipsters burning for the ancient heavenly connection to the starry dynamo in the machinery of night. Who poverty and tatters and hollow-eyed and high sat up smoking in the supernatural darkness of cold water flats floating across the tops of cities, contemplating jazz. Who bared their brains to heaven under the L and saw Mohammedan angels staggering on tenement roofs illuminated. Who passed through universities with radiant, cool eyes, hallucinating Arkansas and Blake Light tragedy among the scholars of war. Who were expelled from the academies for crazy and publishing obscene odes on the windows of the skull. Who cowered in unshaven rooms in underwear, burning their money in wastebaskets and listening to the terror through the wall. Who got busted in their pubic beards returning through Laredo with a belt of marijuana for New York. Who ate fire in paint hotels or drank turpentine in Paradise Alley, Death, or purgatory their torsos night after night, with dreams, with drugs, with waking nightmares, alcohol and cock and endless balls. Incomparable blind streets of shuddering cloud and lightning in the mind, leaping toward poles of Canada and Patterson, illuminating all the motionless world of time between. Peyote solidities of halls, backyard green tree cemetery dawns, wine drunkenness over the rooftops, storefront burrows of tea-head joyride neon blinking traffic light, sun and moon and tree vibrations in the roaring winter dusks of Brooklyn, ash can rantings and kind king light of mind, who chained themselves to subways for the endless ride from Battery to Holy Bronx on Benzedrine until the noise of wheels and children brought them down, shuddering, mouth-racked and battered, bleak of brain, all drained of brilliance in the drear light of zoo, who sank all night in submarine light of Bickford's, floated out and sat through the stale beer afternoon in desolate Fugazzi's, listening to the crack of doom on the hydrogen jukebox, who talked continuously 70 hours from park to pad to bar to Bellevue to museum to the Brooklyn Bridge, a lost battalion of platonic conversationalists jumping down the stoops, off fire escapes, off window sills, off Empire State, out of the moon, yakety yakking, screaming, vomiting, whispering facts and memories and anecdotes and eyeball kicks and shocks of hospitals and jails and wars, whole intellects disgorged in total recall for 7 days and nights with brilliant eyes, meet for the synagogue cast on the pavement, who vanished into nowhere Zen, New Jersey, leaving a trail of ambiguous picture postcards of Atlantic City Hall, suffering Eastern sweats and Tangerian bone grindings and migraines of China under junk withdrawal in Newark's bleak furnished room, who wandered around and around at midnight in the railroad yard, wondering where to go, and went, leaving no broken hearts, who lit cigarettes in boxcars, racketing through snow toward lonesome farms in grandfather night, who study Plotinus, Poe, St. John of the Cross, telepathy, and Bop Kabbalah because the cosmos instinctively vibrated at their feet in Kansas, who loaned it through the streets of Idaho, seeking visionary Indian angels who were visionary Indian angels, who thought they were only mad when Baltimore gleamed in supernatural ecstasy, who jumped in limousines with the Chinamen of Oklahoma on the impulse of winter midnight street light small town rain, who lounged hungry and lonesome through Houston, seeking jazz or sex or soup, and followed the brilliant Spaniard to converse about America and eternity, a hopeless task, and so took ship to Africa, who disappeared into the volcanoes of Mexico, leaving behind nothing but the shadow of dungarees and the lava and ash of poetry scattered in fireplace Chicago, who reappeared on the West Coast, investigating the FBI in beards and shorts with big pacifist eyes, sexy in their dark skin, passing out incomprehensible leaflets, who burned cigarette holes in their arms, protesting the narcotic tobacco haze of capitalism, who distributed super communist pamphlets in Union Square, weeping and undressing, while the sirens of Los Alamos wailed them down and wailed down Wall, and the Staten Island ferry also wailed, who broke down crying in white gymnasiums, naked and trembling before the machinery of other skeletons, who bit detectives in the neck and shrieked with delight in police cars for committing no crime but their own wild cooking, pederasty, and intoxication, who howled on their knees in the subway and were dragged off the roof, waving genitals and manuscripts, who let themselves be fucked in the ass by saintly motorcyclists and screamed with joy, who blew and were blown by those human seraphim, the sailors, caresses of Atlantic and Caribbean love, who bawled in the morning, in the evenings, in rose gardens and the grass of public parks and cemeteries, scattering their semen freely to whomever, come who may, who hiccuped endlessly trying to giggle but wound up with a sob behind a partition in a Turkish bath when the blonde and naked angel came to pierce them with a sword, who lost their love boys to the three old shrews of fate, the one-eyed shrew of the heterosexual dollar, the one-eyed shrew that winks out of the womb, and the one-eyed shrew that does nothing but sit on her ass and snip the intellectual golden threads of the craftsman's loom, who copulated ecstatic and insatiate with a bottle of beer, a sweetheart, a package of cigarettes, a candle, and fell off the bed and continued along the floor and down the hall and ended fainting on the wall with a vision of ultimate cunt and cum eluding the last jism of consciousness, who sweetened the snatches of a million girls trembling in the sunset and were red-eyed in the morning, but prepared to sweeten the snatch of the sunrise, flashing buttocks under barns and naked in the lake, who went out whoring through Colorado in myriad stolen night cars, N.C., secret hero of these poems, Coxman and Adonis of Denver, joy to the memory of his innumerable lays of girls in empty lots and diner backyards, movie houses, rickety rows on mountaintops in caves, or with gaunt waitresses in familiar roadside lonely petticoat upliftings, and especially secret gas station solipsisms of John's and hometown alleys too, who faded out in vast sordid movies, were shifted in dreams, woke on a sudden Manhattan, and picked themselves up out of basements hung over with heartless Tokay and horrors of Third Avenue iron dreams, and stumbled to unemployment offices, who walked all night with their shoes full of blood on the snowbank docks, waiting for a door in the East River to open to a room full of steam, heat, and opium, who created great suicidal dramas on the apartment cliff banks of the Hudson under the wartime blue floodlight of the moon, and their heads shall be crowned with laurel in oblivion, who ate the lamb stew of the imagination or digested the crab at the muddy bottom of the rivers of Bowery, who wept at the romance of the streets with their push carts full of onions and bad music, who sat in boxes breathing in the darkness under the bridge and rose up to build harpsichords in their lofts, who coughed on the 6th floor of Harlem, crowned with flame under the tubercular sky, surrounded by orange crates of theology, who scribbled all night, rocking and rolling over lofty incantations, which in the yellow morning were stanzas of gibberish, who cooked rotten animals, lung, heart, feet, tail, borscht, and tortillas, dreaming of the pure vegetable kingdom, who plunged themselves under meat trucks, looking for an egg, who threw their watches off the roof to cast their ballot for eternity outside of time, and alarm clocks fell on their heads every day for the next decade, who cut their wrists 3 times successively, unsuccessfully, gave up, and were forced to open antique stores where they thought they were growing old and cried, who were burned alive in their innocent flannel suits on Madison Avenue amid blasts of leaden verse and the tanked-up clatter of the iron regiments of fashion and the nitroglycerin shrieks of the fairies of advertising and the mustard gas of sinister, intelligent editors, or were run down by the drunken taxicabs of absolute reality, who jumped off the Brooklyn Bridge, this actually happened, and walked away unknown and forgotten into the ghostly days of Chinatown, soup, alleyways, and fire trucks, not even one free beer. who sang out of their windows in despair, fell out of the subway window, jumped in the filthy Passaic, leaped on Negroes, cried all over the street, danced on broken wine glasses barefoot, smashed phonograph records of nostalgic European 1930s German jazz, finished the whiskey and threw up, groaning into the bloody toilet, moans in their ears and the blast of colossal steam whistles, who barreled down the highways of the past, journeying to each other's hot rod Golgotha jail solitude watch or Birmingham jazz incarnation, who drove cross country 72 hours to find out if I had a vision or you had a vision or he had a vision, to find out eternity, who journeyed to Denver, who died in Denver, who came back to Denver and waited in vain, who watched over Denver and brooded and loaned in Denver, and finally went away to find out the time, and now Denver is lonesome for her heroes, who fell on their knees in hopeless cathedrals, praying for each other's salvation and light and breasts until the soul illuminated its hair for a second, who crashed through their minds in jail, waiting for impossible criminals with golden heads and the charm of reality in their hearts, who sang sweet blues to Alcatraz, who retired to Mexico to cultivate a habit, or Rocky Mount to tender Buddha, or Tangiers to boys, or Southern Pacific to the black locomotive, or Harvard to Narcissus, to Woodlawn, to the daisy chain or grave, who demanded sanity trials accusing the radio of hypnotism and were left with their insanity and their hands and a hung jury, who threw potato salad at CCNY lecturers on Dadaism and subsequently presented themselves on the granite steps of the madhouse with shaven heads and harlequin speech of suicide, demanding instantaneous lobotomy, who were given instead the concrete void of insulin, metrazole, electricity, hydrotherapy, psychotherapy, occupational therapy, ping pong, and amnesia, who in humorless protest overturned only one symbolic ping pong table, resting briefly in catatonia, returning years later truly bald except for a wig of blood and tears and fingers to the visible madman doom of the wards of the mad towns of the East. Pilgrim states, Rocklands, and Greystone's fetid halls, bickering with the echoes of the soul, rocking and rolling in the midnight solitude bench dolmen realms of love, dream of life a nightmare, bodies turned to stone as heavy as the moon, with mother finally fucked and the last fantastic book flung out of the tenement window, and the last door closed at 4 a.m., and the last telephone slammed at the wall in reply, and the last furnished room emptied down to the last piece of mental furniture, a yellow paper rose twisted on a wire hanger in the closet, and even that imaginary, nothing but a hopeful little bit of hallucination. Ah, Carl, while you are not safe, I am not safe. And now you're really in the total animal soup of time. And who, therefore, ran through the icy streets, obsessed with a sudden flash of the alchemy of the use of the ellipsis, catalog, a variable measure, and the vibrating plane? Who dreamt and made incarnate gaps in time and space through images juxtaposed, and trapped the archangel of the soul between two visual images, and joined the elemental verbs and set the noun and dash of consciousness together, jumping with sensation of pater omnipotens aeterna Deus, to recreate the syntax and measure of poor human prose and stand before you speechless and intelligent and shaking with shame, rejected yet confessing out the soul to conform to the rhythm of thought in his naked and endless head. The madman, bum, and angel beat in time, unknown, yet putting down here what might be left to say in time come after death. And rose, reincarnate, in the ghostly clothes of jazz, in the gold horn shadow of the band, and blew the suffering of America's naked mind for love into an Eli, Eli, lama, lama, sabachthani saxophone cry that shivered the cities down to the last radio. With the absolute heart of the poem of life butchered out of their own bodies, good to eat 1,000 years.
Wow.
Yes, wow is the correct response.
I just want to, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just want, this is Scott. I just wanted to say that I love the fact that I got to actually hear Allen Ginsberg's voice before in person, such that anytime, even as you read it,
Yeah.
you know, you hear his voice and his, what do you call it, cadence,
Yes.
and the
Yeah.
whole thing.
Yes.
And I don't know if one could have that sense without having heard the poet himself.
Yeah.
I also wondered, I hope you're going to take like, what, a year to go through this? Because
we
really,
can do it. Yeah, sure.
and am I the only one that laughs out loud? I mean, my mic was muted, but 5 or 6 times I was just laughing very hard.
Oh yeah. No, there's
yeah.
there's parts of it that are hilarious. Absolutely. You know, I mean, he's trying to get the whole drama of human consciousness as he was experiencing it, and you know, some parts are sometimes you're laughing, sometimes you're crying, sometimes you're laughing and crying at the same moment.
Do you know, did he do this all in one fell swoop?
Write it?
Yeah. I wouldn't put it past him, would you?
I'm not sure. I think the 3 parts were written separately, at least part of it, at least part 1. I believe he was, part 2, I believe he was, I'm not going to read part 2, I promise, but part 2 came out of a vision, a terrifying vision, when he was sitting in his, you know, cold water flat in Harlem and looking across the way at the windows of the big apartment buildings, and he saw the whole thing as a monstrous skull, and all the windows as the you know, multitudinous eyes of the skull, and for him that became Moloch. And you know, Moloch is this figure in the Bible, in the Old Testament. He was this horrible god that was like a furnace god that they would start to light the sacrificial fire in the mouth of Moloch and throw babies into the fire.
Oh yeah.
So this was this vision of all of you know, of his contemporary society as being this all-devouring Moloch. And he wrote that while high on peyote, I believe, and you know, looking out the window and having that vision.
That's what I wondered. What about part 1? Was he on a trip?
I don't know. I don't recall. I don't recall. But certainly there's a there seem to have been some substances. There seems to have been some substance use or abuse involved certainly in the, you know, no secret that a lot of the experiences he talks about involve drugs and you know, generally there was a whole lot of sense, not just with the beats, but, you know, going back at least to the Romantic poets, that you had to be high in some way to be inspired to compose. You know, the rare poets like William Blake was a natural. You know, we talked about that months ago. You know, William Blake at the age of 4 was seeing God leaning his forehead against the window. You know, Blake didn't need any drugs. And then you get when Blake, and Blake was dismissed as a madman, but in his old age, finally, this younger generation started coming up of Keats and Shelley and Byron, and they all wanting to be visionaries like Blake did their share of ingesting substances, trying to get there.
Is there a word in, I don't know, you taught English, right? So
yeah.
Is there a word that describes, is this just called free form or stream of consciousness, or
generally we call this free verse.
Free verse, okay.
Free verse. The term was actually coined by French literary critics around the turn of the century, beginning of the 20th century. They said it first in French, vers libre. Am I saying that right, Yafa? Vers,
vers. You wouldn't say the yes. But
yeah. Vers libre. But 50 years before the French made up a name for it, Walt Whitman was doing it in Leaves of Grass. He pretty much invented it in Leaves of Grass, but there's this insane, really insane poem. It was written in an insane asylum by a guy named Christopher Smart in the 17th century called, we should do this. Maybe we'll do this next. Yeah, we'll do this next time. This is a good follow-up to this. It's called For I Will Consider My Cat Jeffrey. And it's hilarious. He's just, it's Christopher Smart in the loony bin tripping out with his cat, and it's very similar to this in structure and in rhythm. You seem like tapping into the same kind of place, and getting beatific stuff and beat down stuff as well.
Lastly, I'm just curious.
But Scott, let me mention before I forget that, I didn't hear Ginsberg read this in person. I heard him read other stuff in person. And I had this record I mentioned last time that, in high school, I used to play this record over and over of him reading the stuff. You can get it from iTunes now. And so to some degree, his cadences are, probably coming through what I'm doing here.
Yeah. Actually, I was lucky enough to get that big CD set and have him sign it that time he was in Long Beach.
Oh, nice.
I have to dig it out. But what I wanted to ask was, was this pre his dabbling, or not dabbling, but was this pre his investigation into, let's say, Buddhism and Trungpa and all of that?
Yes.
And even pre him looking into spiritual things, would you say?
No. I mean, it's in here where he says
a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, who studied Plotinus, Poe, Saint John of the Cross, to so certainly there was that awareness and enough to joke about it. This is one of my favorite things. This is, to me, the most hilarious line of the poem. Who vanished into nowhere Zen, New Jersey.
Yeah, that's great.
And I have to tell you, for the 33 years that I lived in New Jersey, no freaking time off for good behavior, that phrase was in the back of my mind somewhere the whole time. It's like, here I am, nowhere Zen, New Jersey.
Well, I can't wait till you get to that line to talk about it. But yeah, he was looking into it then to some degree, but also this is the mid-50s. The teachings, the Dharma teachings, were not available in this country in the 50s the way they are now. So this would have been even before anybody from the West went to see Neem Karoli Baba, even, probably.
Oh yeah, no, yeah. Ram Dass goes to see Neem Karoli Baba in 1969. This is like 14 years after this.
Okay.
But it's a very good point, Scott, because really that gives context to the whole thing, which is so much of this is about suffering and desperation.
Yeah.
Right.
And searching.
And the suffering and desperation comes from searching and not finding. Or only finding with the, taking so many drugs and, pursuing such intense drug experiences and such intense sexual experiences, and thinking of the beatific vision as some kind of high, some kind of peak experience. And when you're trying, and when you've been there, I mean, I remember I had this thing happen in my, hippie days and my psychedelic days, where, I'd have like the peak, illumination experience on acid. And then I would, and my little motto to myself then was, be true to the highest thing you've seen. Right. Which was this very beautiful notion. But then when you come down from the substance that was showing you the highest thing and still trying to live it when you're not really experiencing it, is artificial, and it becomes exhausting. If that's making sense to you.
Yeah.
And in a sense, this is the kind of thing that's happening here. Just to give, I'm really glad you brought this up, Scott, because the history is really interesting. For one thing, the first exposures to Zen came from in this country, came from American GIs who fought in the Pacific Theater during the Second World War and wound up in Japanese concentration camps.
Wow. So pre-Alan Watts even?
Yeah. And I'll get to, yeah. And so that was this first wave, and so then they brought some of that really in a very small way back to the West Coast. And then what you get, like the first person who really had was connected with the Beat Circle was Gary Snyder. Right. Who was from the West Coast, was this kind of academic mountain man, and he's still alive, by the way. He's 80 something. He's still around. He's the last of. He was always the most sensible, and he was the one who was tuned into genuine Dharma practice before any of the others. And when you read, in particular, when you read Kerouac's book, The Dharma Bums, they talk about, Kerouac and Ginsberg, he gives them all different names, but basically it's a journal of what actually happened. And they all go to the West Coast, and they all, start studying Dharma through Gary Snyder. And you see how they're understanding it, and also a lot how they're misunderstanding it, but they just didn't have the kind of guidance. Because then the other thing that happened was in 1960 something, the immigration laws were loosened up in 1960 something. And so for the first time, it became relatively easy for Dharma teachers of various threads from Asia to come over here and teach. So you get Suzuki Roshi coming to San Francisco and starting the Zen Center. You get Bhaktivedanta Swami coming from India and starting the first. We talked about this last week. Sue brought this up, or Freeman, the first storefront Hare Krishna Center in New York City, which he used to hang out at, and the second one in San Francisco, where I used to hang out. Maharishi Mahesh Yogi was able to come over. All the gurus and the Roshis were able to come over for the first time. Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche, the first Tibetan master to teach in an ongoing way in the United States, set up in Boulder, and Ginsberg became a student of his, but that was all later on.
Was that more the 70s?
Yes.
Trungpa? Okay.
Yes.
Of course, there was the 1920s when there were some of those masters came, like Yogananda.
Yes. Yeah.
But then there was a gap where they couldn't come.
Yeah, and right. Yes, you had Yogananda, and by the way, a beautiful film, beautiful documentary film that was made by some friends of Yafa's and mine, is called Awake: The Life of Yogananda. And if you haven't seen that, you can get that online now. And it's just gorgeous. And it's really hard to make a film about spirituality, about enlightenment, without it being cheesy. And they they did it. They accomplished it. It's a beautiful film, so highly recommended. So yeah, so Yogananda managed to come over in the 20s, but there wasn't much of anyone else. But you had the people like Ginsberg and Kerouac who had this drive, and they did what they could with the materials they had. I mean, even when I started getting interested in this stuff in high school in the mid 60s, it was a lot harder to find the books. I certainly didn't have teachers to a couple of years later, I went up north to San Francisco for college till I dropped out a year later. And there were teachers there, and it was incredible. But before that, I found like 3 books. I found the little paperback editions of the Tao Te Ching and the Bhagavad Gita and selected Upanishads. And,
that was a good start though.
Yeah, it was a great start. And, here I'm this just clueless white kid sitting in the suburbs of LA reading these little paperback books, trying to figure out what they're about. But there's always going to be some people with that impulse.
Alan Watts would have been late 50s though, right? San Francisco? Wasn't
Alan,
by then?
Alan Watts was from England, and he came through a whole other path. He started off, he was a
minister, right?
Yeah, he was, I think, an Episcopal priest who started making a connection with world religion. See, this was through the academic thread. Now, Houston Smith is a key guy. Houston Smith was a professor of world religions that Yaffa's mom studied with, right?
Oh, wow.
Yes, she did. Yeah.
Incredible.
Where was that?
At Washington U in the 50s.
Yeah. But the reason Houston Smith got tuned in as just this completely isolated guy was he was the son of a pair of Christian missionaries who had gone to China to convert the heathen Chinese to Christianity. And so the first few or several years of his life, Houston Smith grew up there, and he went, wow, look at this. Look what's over here. And you can find online the old black and white films of Houston Smith lecturing, and he's this tall, skinny, gawky young guy, and he sits down on the desk in the lotus pose, in 1953 or something, at a time when that was totally bizarre. Good. Okay. So we're not going to deconstruct this line by line. That I guarantee you.
I don't understand.
Yeah. But what other reactions does anyone else have, or other particular things that caught your attention, or lines that you want to talk about?
Has anything changed?
Who's talking? Who's talking? Oh, Lulu. Has anything changed?
Yes.
Good thought.
Well, you tell me.
I don't think so. Everything is the same as it used to be, but we are looking at it from a different window.
Well, nothing has changed, and everything has changed. I mean,
our perception, yes.
Well,
but the reality is the same.
Well, I mean, the fundamental reality, yeah, which is, the fundamental reality can't change because it's beyond time, it's beyond conditions. Right. But the way it's expressed is changing in every moment. You're when I get to the end of this sentence, you're going to be older than you were when I started it. Everything's melting and transforming in every moment. Yaffa, what's that French expression? The more things change, the more they remain the same.
Right.
Yes, that's it.
Yeah. Okay. That's it. That's it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, you know, there's always going to be people who are seekers. There's always going to be confusion on the path, and then hopefully illumination on the path. But I mean, we've just, you know, for the last 10 minutes talked a lot about how on the, you know, even though on the absolute level, things remain the same, on the relative level, it's changed a whole lot. You know, now some kid who is, you know, sitting on some farmhouse in Nebraska can go online and find, you know, genuine Dharma teachings from genuine masters, and hear chanting, and you can chant mantras and do, you know, guided meditation with me and with a bunch of other people who do this stuff online. Now you can also connect with, you know, as we've seen with you know, neo-fascist white supremacist groups, and go down those rabbit holes of insanity. So, you know, things are the same. There's always sanity and insanity. There's always kindness and violence. You know, you pays your nickel and you takes your choice.
I'd like to say that's, you know, you just said, brought it to mind how incredible it is that anyone, anywhere practically has access to all of this. Yet I can see what, and I don't recall the woman's name who spoke up.
Mm-hmm.
At that level, you can come down to where even without that access to all the teachings and all the wisdom, at some level,
mm-hmm.
thing, you know, the human nature is there that can find the deepest wisdom, right? Even could have found it on a barn roof in Nebraska, even maybe never having heard any of it, right?
Right. But also, if you don't know what it is, if you don't have words for it, and if you're the only one, it's very easy to think you must be crazy. Very seriously. And I'm quite confident that there's people who wound up, you know, institutionalized, or, you know, and getting shock therapy and so forth. And, you know, you dial back a couple of centuries, you know, having someone trying to whip the devils out of them, just because they had no frame of reference. They had no vocabulary for understanding what it was.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, I had stuff in my childhood that, you know, where I don't need to get into that, but some stuff, just like opening experiences. Like I got this thing on and off. I don't know if it was for weeks or months or years, but experiencing that I had no face, that it was as if I was unzipped, that everyone else was like zipped in the seam down the middle. They were closed and I was open, which was just my kind of a way of experiencing boundlessness. Right. But I never mentioned it to anyone.
Yeah, you could have been put away for that in certain.
Yeah, I could have been put. But the funny thing is, it never occurred to me to mention it to anyone. It just, I don't know why. I can't tell you why, but it just somehow I knew. I just didn't think about mentioning it. I just kind of went, huh. And also, you know, there's the aspect of sexual expression here, which is. You know, again,
all over the map.
And again, if you think of that kid sitting in the farmhouse in Kansas, if he's gay, things are a lot easier now.
Oh yeah, because then before it would have just been, you know, I must be the only. People have said I must be the only person.
Yeah,
and you know, to you know, I'll jump off the barn roof because I can't live.
Yeah. And
so
that
what
happened.
A difference now, right?
What a huge difference. Thank God. Yaf and I were watching last night a documentary about Alan Carr, the fabulous Alan Carr, the Hollywood producer who he produced Grease and the infamous 61st Oscars, where Rob Lowe danced with Snow White, and he was always referred to as flamboyant, which was the code word then for gay. And
right.
And you have a couple of people who were his friends and associates of the time, talking in the documentary about how, I was gay and he was gay, but we never talked about it because it was code. We only talked in code. Everything was so secret then.
Yeah.
And that that was just a few decades ago.
And then Ginsberg, of course, was not flamboyant at all. I mean, you wouldn't even guess. I wouldn't.
But all this expression, like in the poem, that must have been outrageous at the time.
Yeah.
To write about this.
Yeah, this poem became the subject of a criminal prosecution.
Yeah, J. Edgar Hoover and Roy Cohn would have wanted to, have him killed as they went on doing everything that's in the poem.
Have him killed at the before he dragged them out of the closet. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
Dean, I have one.
Yes, please.
If I didn't interrupt somebody.
Please.
That was a perfect segue into my question. It's and it has to do with meditation too, and kind of maybe working things out, letting it go. Self-expression. This poem doesn't particularly. It almost reminds me, like, they say there's those people who watch horror films and those who don't a little bit. Okay. I'm on those who don't side. Like I'm already a little bit intense. And so like anything that's like more intense than me generally just pushes me over the edge.
Right.
So I can watch like children's films and that's pretty good.
Yeah. But when Bambi's mother is shot.
Oh yeah. Don't even get me started about Finding Nemo. It was really stressful for me. Right. I'm just kidding. But this poem reminds me a little bit of a horror film for me. Like it was something that it sort of triggered me a little farther. I mean, it didn't it was not the particular release that I needed. And it gets me thinking about this time period and censorship or whatever, these compartmentalization of people and their self-expression. And I was just kind of curious with that as a leading point. What do you think when someone puts out a piece that speaks to a certain pile of people and then it doesn't speak to others?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Well, that's another one of those things that's, always going to be. and also that sometimes whether it's a poem or a film or a piece of music or, anything might not speak to the person you are this year, but might speak to the person you're going to be next year or next week.
Right.
So
it's sometimes on the other side of it, as the artist myself, I do write music too. And so when I release it, I have a real strong, talk about the wave and the ocean inside of our meditation practice, right? I'm very much at one with the audience, and I do kind of write with them in mind. Almost, I'd like to say, if I got real mathematical about it, like a 50-50 of thinking about my own self-expression as well as 50% of how good is this for. And I've been struggling lately, wondering if it should be like 80-20, if I'm like, as I'm an introvert during COVID, I'm like, screw them, 80% for me, 20% like up your alley if it works for you. Okay. This reminds me, and a lot of certain male poets from this era remind me of like maybe a 90-10. It's an interesting concept, but It just feels like it's very clearly like maybe an egocentric response to, I don't know. It's a little bit like, this is my thoughts going on in my head.
Yeah.
Transitional process.
Yeah. Okay. So we're going to end on this. I'm just going to say one thing and we'll end because it's after 6. But yeah, look at the first line. I saw the best minds of my generation. There's some self-advertising there, we could say.
Right.
That's a tad. Okay. This is me and my buddies, me and Burroughs and Kerouac, and we're the best minds. We're the we're the elite. We're going to suffer because we're being put through all this because we're smarter than the rest. There is that element. Just a few days ago, writer friend of mine sent me this incredible quote. I forget who it's from now. I have it written down. It was from a writer. And someone asked him, and I think this is like the answer to your question about 80-20 or 50-50. Someone asked him, who do you write for? And he said, well, I don't write for myself because that would be self-indulgent. I don't write for the audience because that would be pandering. I write for the thing that is trying to be born. And on that note,
that's a great quote.
Yeah, thank you.
It is.
Yeah,
That's perfect.
Good.
Yeah.
I like that.
On that note, my friends, see you next week.
Right. Thank
you. Great time.
Enjoy being.
Take care.